There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We drag them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. The grave is meant to be the final silence, the ultimate end. But for one man, buried alive in a moonlit graveyard, the true horror is not his own predicament, but the terrifying discovery that he is not alone in the darkness. In the heart of old London, in a smoke-filled room warmed by a roaring fire and an abundance of fine brandy, sat the members of the Wonder Club. They were not scientists or explorers, as their name might suggest, but a collection of young, wealthy gentlemen whose primary occupation was the relentless pursuit of amusement. They were men with too much time, too much money, and a dangerous appetite for the unusual. Their weekly gatherings were dedicated to the art of storytelling, each member trying to outdo the others with tales of the bizarre, the macabre, and the supernatural. On this particular evening, the stories had been exceptionally grim. They had spoken of specters on the misty fens, of ancient family curses, and of dark rituals performed in forgotten country manners. The air was thick with imagined horrors and the sweet, cloying smoke of cigars. It was an atmosphere that encouraged boasts, a fertile ground for pride to overgrow reason. It was in this heady environment that young Jack, flushed with brandy and the thrill of the tales, made his fatal error. After a particularly chilling story about a man who had been accidentally buried alive, one of the more cynical members of the club scoffed. "It's all nonsense," he declared. "The true fear is not of ghosts, but of the darkness and the cold. I'd wager no man in this room has the nerve to spend a single night alone in an open grave. The mind would play tricks. The silence would break him." A murmur of agreement went around the room. But Jack, whose pride was always more potent than any brandy, saw this not as a statement of fact, but as a personal challenge. A reckless, foolish bravado surged through him. "I'll take that wager," he announced, his voice louder and more confident than he felt. 100 guineas says I can do it. From midnight until the first light of dawn. The silence won't break me. No trick of the mind will make me call for help." The room fell silent, then erupted in a mixture of laughter and excited shouts. The wager was made. The foolishness was set in stone. Jack, trapped by his own arrogant words, could not back down. He felt a flicker of unease, a small, sober voice in the back of his mind screaming at him to retract the bet, but it was drowned out by the roar of his pride and the cheers of his so-called friends. An hour later, Jack found himself in a carriage, rattling through the dark, deserted streets of London and out into the countryside. His friends, their faces alight with a cruel, drunken mirth, were taking him to the chosen location. It was not a neat city cemetery. They were taking him to the churchyard of St. Giles, a place that was ancient even by England's standards. As they left the last of the city's gaslights behind, a sense of profound, oppressive isolation began to settle over Jack. The carriage rolled onto a narrow, rutted lane, the branches of ancient, overhanging trees scraping against the roof like skeletal fingers. Finally, they came to a stop before a lychgate, its old timbers leaning at a drunken angle. Beyond it lay the graveyard. It was a place straight out of one of their ghost stories. The church itself was a ruin, a dark, crumbling silhouette against a sky of bruised purple clouds. Only its stone tower remained intact, a grim, lonely sentinel watching over the dead. The graveyard that surrounded it was a testament to centuries of death and neglect. Tombstones, their inscriptions erased by years of wind and rain, leaned at all angles, like a forest of crooked, gray teeth. Some had fallen over completely, half swallowed by the grasping earth. Iron crosses, rusted and bent, stood guard over sunken, forgotten plots. And dominating the entire scene were the yew trees. They were immense, ancient things, their trunks gnarled and twisted into monstrous shapes, their dark, dense foliage so thick that it seemed to absorb the faint moonlight, creating pools of absolute, impenetrable blackness. The air here was different. It was cold, still, and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The boisterous energy of the London clubroom felt a world away. Here, in the profound silence of this forgotten place, Jack's drunken bravado began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The wager no longer seemed like a thrilling game. It felt like a terrible, irreversible mistake. His friends, however, were still caught up in the spirit of the thing. They laughed and joked as they led him through the leaning gravestones, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. They led him to a freshly dug plot near the back of the churchyard, a perfect rectangular wound in the earth. A local man had died, and his funeral was set for the following day. The grave was ready. It was a 6-foot-deep pit of darkness, its walls a sheer drop of damp, black soil. It was waiting. "Your chariot awaits, brave Jack," one of his friends called out, his laughter echoing unnaturally in the dead silence. They lowered a small, rickety ladder into the pit. Feigning a confidence he was a million miles from feeling, Jack handed his coat and hat to one of his friends. He tried to return their jests, to play the part of the fearless adventurer, but his voice sounded thin and weak to his own ears. He took hold of the ladder and began his descent into the darkness. The moment he stepped off the bottom rung and onto the soft, yielding earth of the grave floor, a profound sense of claustrophobia seized him. The world above shrank to a small, gray rectangle of night sky. The sheer, earthen walls seemed to press in on him, and the rich, loamy smell of the grave, the smell of finality, filled his nostrils. It was like being at the bottom of a well. His friends peered down at him, their faces pale and distorted in the lantern light. "We'll leave you the brandy for courage," one shouted, lowering down a bottle on a rope. "And we'll be back at dawn to collect you, or what's left of you." With a final, ringing chorus of laughter, they pulled up the ladder. Their footsteps and voices began to recede, leaving Jack alone in his narrow, earthen prison. He watched their lanterns dwindle to tiny, dancing sparks among the tombstones, and then they were gone. He was utterly, completely alone in the ancient, silent graveyard, standing at the bottom of an open grave. The wager had begun. For the first few minutes after his friend's laughter had faded into the night, Jack's world was a small, defiant bubble of bravado. He stood in the center of the 6-foot-deep pit, took a long pull from the brandy bottle, and scoffed at the darkness. It was just a hole in the ground. The silence was just an absence of noise. He was Jack, a man of the modern world, a member of the Wonder Club. He was master of his own senses, and he would not be broken by a mere lack of stimulation. The 100 guineas were as good as his. But the bravado, fueled by the fading warmth of the brandy and the lingering echo of his own pride, was a thin, brittle shield. And as the minutes stretched into an eternity, the true nature of his prison began to assert itself. The shield began to crack. The first thing to assail him was the silence. It was unlike any silence he had ever known. In London there was always a sound, a low background hum of life. Here, in this ancient, forgotten churchyard, the silence was absolute. It was a physical presence, a heavy, velvet blanket that smothered all noise. It pressed in on him, filling his ears until they began to ring with a high, thin, keening sound, the sound of his own nervous system screaming into the void. The only other sound was the frantic pounding of his own heart, a desperate, lonely drumbeat in the vast, dead quiet. It was so loud, so frantic, that he worried it might burst. He became acutely aware of his own biology, of the wet, soft sounds of his own body, the whisper of his breath, the subtle creak of his joints. In this profound silence, the simple act of being alive felt deafeningly, obscenely loud. Then came the smell. He was standing on a floor of loose, freshly turned soil, and the walls around him were made of it. The scent was overpowering, inescapable. It was the rich, loamy, and deeply primal smell of the earth itself. It was the smell of damp soil, of crushed roots and unseen, burrowing things. But it was more than that. It was the smell of decay, of the slow, patient, and inexorable process of dissolution. He was breathing in the very essence of the grave, the scent of finality. It was a thick, heavy smell that coated the back of his throat and seemed to fill his lungs not with air, but with a fine, dark dust. He felt as if he were slowly, breath by breath, being filled with the very substance of his prison. He took another swig of the brandy, but its sharp, alcoholic tang was immediately swallowed by the overwhelming, earthy perfume of his tomb. As the warmth of the brandy began to fade for good, he became aware of the cold. This, too, was a cold unlike any he had ever experienced. It was not the crisp, clean cold of the night air above. He could feel that on the exposed skin of his face. This was a deeper, more penetrating cold that seeped into him from all sides. It radiated from the damp, earthen walls of the grave, a constant, unchanging chill that seemed to be actively drawing the heat from his body. It was the cold of the deep earth, a cold that had not been touched by the sun for millennia. It crept through the fabric of his fine city clothes, through his skin, through his muscles, until it settled deep in his bones. He began to shiver not just from the surface cold, but from this profound internal chill. It was a cold that felt ancient and eternal, and it whispered to him of the final, permanent cold that awaited all men. He tried to distract himself. He paced the short length of his prison, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. He recited poetry in his head. He tried to recall the faces of the girls he had danced with. He thought about how he would spend the 100 guineas. But the sensory assault of his environment was too powerful. The silence, the smell, and the cold were a trinity of dread that systematically dismantled his defenses. The most powerful weapon the grave possessed, however, was the darkness. The moon, his only connection to the world of light, was playing a cruel game. When it was visible, a pale, silvery rectangle of light appeared above him, and the earthen walls of his prison took on a faint, detailed texture. He could see the small stones and roots embedded in the dark soil. He could see his own hands, his own feet. He could confirm that he was real, that he was still there. But then, a thick bank of cloud would drift across the moon, and the darkness that descended was absolute. It was not just an absence of light. It was a physical substance, a thick, tangible blackness that was as suffocating as a shroud. In these moments of total blindness, the boundaries of his own body seemed to dissolve. He could no longer tell where his skin ended and the earthen walls began. The darkness pressed in, hot and close against his eyelids, and he felt as if he were already buried, the heavy soil already packed around him. The air itself felt black and thick, and with every breath, he imagined he was drawing it, like a fine, dark silt, into his lungs. It was during one of these periods of absolute blackness that his mind truly began to betray him. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with imagined sounds. He heard the faint, dry rustle of something burrowing in the wall next to his head. He heard a soft, wet sigh that seemed to come from the earth beneath his feet. He reached out and touched the wall, and the damp, crumbly soil felt, for a terrifying instant, like cold, yielding flesh. Panic, a true, primal panic, began to rise in his throat like bile. The foolishness of the wager, the sheer, idiotic arrogance of it, crashed down on him with the weight of a tombstone. What was he doing here? He was a gentleman. He belonged in a warm bed, in a safe room, surrounded by light and life. He did not belong here, in this cold, dark, silent hole, this rehearsal for his own death. He opened his mouth to shout, to scream for his friends, to concede the bet, to beg them to come and pull him out of this nightmare. He didn't care about the money, he didn't care about his pride. He just wanted out. He wanted the light. He wanted the noise. He wanted to live. But as he drew in a breath to scream, the sound died in his throat. What if they weren't there? What if, in their drunken state, they had forgotten him? What if they had decided to leave him here all night as a cruel prank, only to return at dawn? The thought of shouting, of screaming his terror into an empty, indifferent night, was somehow more horrifying than the silence. His cry for help would only be heard by the dead, by the silent, crumbling tombstones and the ancient, twisted yew trees. His panic would be a private performance, a solitary madness. He slumped against the wall of the grave, his body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. He had boasted that the silence would not break him, that his mind would not play tricks. He had been wrong. He was broken. The grave had won. It had used its ancient, elemental weapons, the silence, the smell, the cold, and the darkness to strip away his pride, his reason, and his courage, leaving him a terrified, shivering animal trapped at the bottom of a pit. He took another long, desperate swallow of the brandy. It no longer tasted of courage, only of bitter, drunken regret. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the damp earth, his knees drawn up to his chest, trying to conserve what little body heat he had left. There was nothing to do but wait, to wait for the slow, agonizing passage of the hours, to wait for the first, blessed hint of dawn, and to pray that his friends remembered their promise, and that he still had a mind left to save when they finally returned. He closed his eyes, but it made no difference. The darkness was just as absolute on the inside as it was on the out. He was in a living tomb, a premature burial, and the night was still young. Hours crawled by with the agonizing slowness of a wounded animal. Jack remained huddled at the bottom of the grave, a shivering, miserable ball of regret. The initial, frantic panic had subsided, leaving behind a cold, dull dread and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The brandy was half gone, its comforting warmth long since vanished, leaving only a sour taste in his mouth. He had drifted into a sort of stupor, a semi-conscious state halfway between a terrified lucidity and a blessed unconsciousness. The world had been reduced to the 4 earthen walls of his prison, the relentless cold, and the thick, suffocating darkness. He was jolted from this daze by a sound. It was a small, furtive sound from directly above him, a faint, skittering noise that was different from the sighing of the wind or the groaning of the ancient yew trees. It was followed by a soft, pattering sound on his shoulder. He flinched, brushing at his coat. A few small pebbles and a trickle of loose, dry soil had fallen on him. For a moment, a flicker of hope, the first he had felt in hours, ignited within him. The earth was settling. That meant dawn must be approaching. The changing temperature, the subtle shift in the atmosphere that precedes the sunrise, must be causing the damp soil to contract and loosen. His ordeal was almost over. His friends would be returning soon, ready to mock him, but also to pull him back into the world of the living. He almost wept with relief. He looked up at the small, gray rectangle of sky, searching for that first, faint hint of blue or pink that would signal his salvation. But the sky remained a uniform, impenetrable slate gray. There was no sign of dawn. The profound, pre-dawn silence of the graveyard remained unbroken. The flicker of hope died, replaced by a renewed sense of unease. Then he heard the new sound. And this sound was not the earth settling. It was a sound from above ground, from the edge of his grave. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound. A sharp, scraping noise, like a metal blade being dragged through gravel. This was followed a second later by a soft, heavy thud. Scrape thud. The sound repeated, over and over, with a steady, unhurried rhythm. A cold, sickening realization washed over Jack, extinguishing his exhaustion in a sudden, white-hot flash of adrenaline. He knew that sound. It was a sound he had heard from a distance on country roads, the sound of workmen mending a lane. It was the unmistakable sound of a shovel. Someone was out there. Someone was standing at the edge of his grave with a shovel, digging into a pile of dirt. His first thought was that it was a gravedigger, arriving impossibly early to prepare for the day's funeral. But that made no sense. No one would be here in the dead of night, hours before the sun was due to rise. His second thought was far worse. It was his friends. They had returned, but they had not come with a ladder. They had come with shovels. The cruel, drunken prank had entered a new, horrifying phase. They weren't just going to leave him in the grave. They were going to torment him, to frighten him further by pretending to bury him. Anger surged through him, momentarily overpowering his fear. "Henry? Thomas? Is that you?" he shouted, his voice hoarse and raw. "Damn you. This has gone far enough. The wager is off. I concede. Now get me out of here." His voice sounded small and pathetic, swallowed by the 6 feet of earth that surrounded him. There was no reply from above, no laughing acknowledgement of his surrender. The only answer was the relentless, terrifying rhythm of the shovel. Scrape thud, scrape thud. "Do you hear me?" he screamed, his voice cracking with a rising panic. "This isn't funny anymore. For God's sake, stop it." The response came a moment later, but it was not a voice. It was a sudden, heavy shower of wet soil that rained down upon him. It struck his face, his hair, his shoulders, the small, damp clods of earth feeling like 100 tiny, cold fists. He cried out, sputtering, trying to shield his face with his arms. The rich, loamy smell of the earth was now a suffocating presence, the taste of it in his mouth. The prank had become a nightmare. This wasn't a joke. He could hear their muffled laughter now, a faint, cruel sound from above. They were actually doing it. They were burying him. "No!" he shrieked, his voice a raw, desperate plea. He tried to scramble up the walls of the grave, his fingers digging uselessly into the damp, crumbly soil, which gave way beneath his grasp. He was trapped. He was utterly, completely at their mercy. The shower of dirt became a torrent. The single shovel had been joined by others. He could hear the frantic, rhythmic scraping of 3 or 4 shovels working in unison. His friends, in their drunken, thoughtless cruelty, were working with a feverish intensity. A constant, heavy rain of earth cascaded down into the pit, and the floor of his prison began to rise. The dirt was around his ankles, then his knees. His weight was immense, pinning him in place. He struggled, thrashing wildly, but it was like trying to fight a rising tide. The heavy, wet soil filled his shoes, packed around his legs, and held him fast. He was being planted like a seed in the ground. "Stop, please, for the love of God, stop," he begged, his words choked with sobs and dirt. He could barely see the rectangle of sky anymore, his vision obscured by the constant downpour of earth. He felt the weight on his chest, a crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe. The dirt was at his waist, then his shoulders. He was sinking not into water, but into the solid body of the earth itself. He could feel the cold, wet soil against his skin, under his clothes a horrifying, intimate violation. The last of the brandy bottle was knocked from his hand, its remaining contents spilling out to be instantly absorbed by the thirsty ground. He was losing his footing, his body being forced down by the sheer, accumulating weight from above. With one final, desperate surge of strength, he pushed himself up, his head breaking the surface of the rising earth. He caught one last, fleeting glimpse of the world above. He saw the dark, swirling clouds, the ghostly, pale light of the moon, and the silhouetted forms of his friends, their arms rising and falling with the shovels in a frantic, demonic rhythm. Then he saw a final shovelful of earth, a black, spade-shaped shadow, arc through the air above him. It descended, a dark curtain falling on the final act of his life. It blotted out the moon, it blotted out the sky, it blotted out everything. The heavy, wet soil struck his face with the force of a blow, filling his open mouth, his nostrils, his eyes. The world dissolved into a sudden, suffocating, and absolute blackness. The pressure was immense, the weight of the world itself pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. His last, silent scream was swallowed by the dirt. He was buried. The prank was complete. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a sudden, brutal shock. It was as if a switch had been thrown in the darkness of his mind, plunging him from a state of non-being directly into a reality of pure, undiluted horror. His first sensation was of pressure. An immense, unyielding weight pressed in on him from every conceivable direction. Above him, below him, to his left, to his right. He was encased, entombed, his limbs pinned in a space so confining he could not move them more than an inch. His second sensation was the darkness. It was a blackness so absolute, so profound, that it felt like a solid object. It was a physical weight against his eyelids. He tried to open them, and for a terrifying moment, he couldn't tell if he had succeeded. The view was the same, open or closed, a perfect, seamless, and suffocating void. His third sensation was the air. It was thick, stale, and horribly warm with the heat of his own body. With every breath he drew, he could feel the limited supply diminishing, the air growing thinner, hotter, more saturated with his own desperate exhalations. A primal, reptilian part of his brain understood instantly. The air was a finite resource. It was a clock, ticking down the final seconds of his life. Panic, a pure, white-hot, animalistic terror, erupted in his chest. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound was a pathetic, muffled croak. It didn't travel. It simply struck the hard surface just inches from his face and fell back into his own ears. A dead, useless sound. He was in a box. A small, narrow, wooden box. The truth crashed down on him with the weight of the 6 feet of earth that was now piled above him. This was not a prank anymore. This was not a game. He was in a coffin. His friends, in their drunken, homicidal foolishness, had not just buried him in the dirt. They had somehow procured a coffin, placed him inside while he was unconscious from his fall or a blow he couldn't remember, and had given him a full and proper burial. The wager had escalated from a test of nerve to a sentence of death. He was going to die here, in the dark, suffocating on his own screams. He began to struggle, a frantic, useless thrashing against the unyielding wood. He pushed upwards with his hands, his knuckles scraping raw against the rough, splintered lid. He beat against it with his fists, the dull, thudding impacts doing nothing but jarring his own bones. He kicked out with his feet, his heels striking the bottom of the box with a hollow, pathetic boom. His efforts were a joke. He was a butterfly beating its wings against the inside of a sealed jar. The only thing he was accomplishing was using up his precious, limited supply of air at a faster rate. Exhausted, his body screaming with the agony of overexerted muscles and the sheer, mind-numbing terror of his situation, he fell still. He had to think. He had to conserve his air. Panicking would only hasten the inevitable. He forced himself to take slow, shallow breaths, fighting the desperate urge to gasp and pant. He strained his ears, listening. Listening for what? A sound from above? The sound of digging? The sound of his friends, overcome with sober remorse, returning to undo their terrible crime? But there was nothing. The world above him was gone. He was insulated from it by 6 feet of solid, sound-devouring earth. The only sounds he could hear were the internal, biological noises of his own body. He could hear the frantic pounding of his heart, a wild, terrified drumbeat in the tomb-like silence. He could hear the blood roaring in his ears, a rushing, tidal sound that filled his head. He could hear the soft, wet rasp of his own breathing, each breath a countdown to his last. This was it. This was the true and final silence, the silence of the grave. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, adrift in a sensory deprivation tank of his own making. His terror began to subside, replaced by a strange, cold, and lucid despair. He began to think of his life, of the foolish, wasted years spent in the pursuit of idle amusement. He thought of his family, of the woman he had intended to court, of all the things he had left unsaid and undone. And it had all led to this. A stupid, drunken bet in a London clubroom had led him to a dark, suffocating box in a forgotten country churchyard. His end was not a grand tragedy, but a squalid, pathetic farce. A single, hot tear rolled down his temple and into his hair. It was a tear of rage, of regret, of a profound and terrible self-pity. And it was in this moment of utter, abject despair when he had finally accepted the totality of his horrifying fate, that he heard it. A sound. It was not a sound from within his own body. It was not a product of his oxygen-starved mind. It was an external sound. It was faint, but it was clear, sharp, and distinct. Top. It was a single, hard, deliberate knock. His breath caught in his throat. His heart, which had been pounding a frantic rhythm, seemed to stop altogether. Where had it come from? It wasn't from above. It was too sharp, too close. It had come from the side. From the wooden wall of his coffin, just inches from his right ear. His mind reeled, desperately trying to process the impossible sensory input. What could it be? A stone, dislodged by the settling earth, striking the side of his coffin? A root expanding and pressing against the wood? It had to be something natural. It had to be. To consider any other possibility was to invite a new and even more profound level of madness into his tomb. He waited, listening with an intensity that was physically painful, every nerve in his body screaming. The silence returned, thick and absolute. He must have imagined it. A hallucination, the first sign of his mind breaking under the strain. He let out a slow, shuddering breath, a small measure of relief mixing with his despair. And then it came again. Tap, tap, top. There was no mistaking it this time. It was coming from the coffin buried next to his. The foundations of his sanity, already cracked and crumbling, shattered into dust. A new and infinitely more terrible horror flooded the void. A horror that made the fear of his own death seem like a quaint and manageable anxiety. He was not alone. In this suffocating, subterranean darkness, he had a neighbor. The implications crashed down on him, each one more terrifying than the last. Who was in that coffin? The grave beside his had been an old one, the tombstone worn and illegible. The occupant had been lying here for a century, or perhaps more. How long had it been awake? How long had it been lying here, in the dark, waiting? Waiting for what? For a new neighbor to arrive? The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Top. Tap tap. Top. It was a different rhythm. It was a question, or a greeting, a horrifying welcome to the neighborhood of the eternally damned. Jack's mind, which had been reeling from the fear of suffocation, now had a new and infinitely more terrible focus. His own death was a certainty, a simple matter of biology. But this was an eternal, supernatural horror. He imagined the thing in the coffin next to him. A desiccated corpse, a skeleton, its bony knuckles rapping against the wood, or something worse, something that had been preserved by the damp earth, something with cold, leathery skin and an awareness that had outlasted its own life. The knocking was a paradox of terror. Was it a plea for help? Was it another poor soul, like him, buried alive, trying to signal their presence to the world? The thought was a small, insane glimmer of hope. Could they communicate? Could they comfort each other in their final, terrible moments? Or was it something else? Was it a menacing, predatory sound? A predator tapping on the wall of its cage, aware that new prey had been delivered next door? Was it an invitation to a horror beyond death? A welcome to a conscious, aware, and eternal existence in the suffocating dark? He was faced with a choice, a final horrifying dilemma in his last moments of life. To die of suffocation, alone with his own terror, or to acknowledge the thing next door, to tap back, to answer the knock from the grave beside his own. He lay there, frozen, his knuckles inches from the wooden wall. The air was growing thin, his vision starting to sparkle with faint, dying lights. But his hearing was sharper than ever, and the knocking continued, patient, rhythmic, eternal, tap, tap, top. Waiting for his reply, the rhythmic knocking from the adjacent coffin did something that Jack would not have thought possible. It made his own tomb feel vast. Before, his world had been the suffocating, claustrophobic confines of his own box. Now, the universe had expanded to include the space next door, an entire other realm of horror separated from him by only a few inches of wood and packed earth. The fear of his own impending death, a simple biological process of suffocation, was suddenly and completely eclipsed by a new, more profound, and infinitely more complex terror. This was the terror of the unknown, the terror of a conscious, active, and communicative entity that shared his subterranean prison. His mind, reeling in the hot, stale air, began a frantic and horrifying interrogation of itself. Who was it? Who was knocking? He tried to picture the grave next to his, remembering the ancient, leaning tombstone, its inscription long since scoured into illegibility by a century or more of wind and rain. The occupant of that coffin had been dead for generations. A skeleton, surely, a collection of dry, disconnected bones, long since stripped of flesh and memory by the patient, tireless work of the earth. But a skeleton could not knock. The image that flooded his mind was far worse. He imagined a corpse that had not properly decayed, preserved by some unique quality in the soil. A body mummified, its skin turned to a dark, tough leather, its ligaments still intact. He pictured a desiccated hand, the fingers stiff and curled, raising itself with an agonizing slowness in the eternal darkness of its own prison. He saw a bony knuckle, driven by some lingering unholy remnant of a will, rapping against the wood.
Top.
Tap.
Top.
A being that had outlasted its own death, that had lain in silent, patient awareness for 100 years, waiting. Waiting for what? For company? The question of its identity was eclipsed by the more urgent question of its intent. The knocking was a signal, a clear and deliberate communication. But what was it trying to say? Jack's mind, desperately seeking any sliver of hope, any possibility of a shared humanity in this inhuman situation, seized on one interpretation. Was it a plea for help? Could it be that, by some grotesque and unbelievable coincidence, he was not the only one? Could the occupant of the next coffin be another victim, another soul buried alive, who had, by some miracle of will or some quirk of supernatural physics, maintained a state of conscious horror for an unimaginable length of time? The thought was both horrifying and, in a strange way, comforting. To not be alone in his suffering, to have a fellow victim. Was the knocking a desperate cry, an attempt to say, "I am here, I am like you, do not despair alone"? If he knocked back, would he receive a frantic, grateful reply? Would they spend their final, shared moments of fading consciousness tapping messages of comfort and solidarity to one another through the dark, damp earth? It was a beautiful, tragic, and utterly insane thought, and as quickly as it came, it was supplanted by a far colder, more probable, and infinitely more terrifying interpretation. Was it a threat? The graveyard was a place of the dead. He was an intruder, a living, breathing, warm-blooded anomaly in a kingdom of cold, silent decay. What if the knocking was not a welcome from a fellow victim, but a warning from a gatekeeper, a territorial, predatory signal? This is our domain. You do not belong here. What if the thing next door was not a victim at all, but a guardian, a ghoul, a monstrous entity that jealously protected its silent kingdom from the living? In this interpretation, the knocking was not a plea. It was a menace. It was the sound of a spider, feeling the vibrations of a fly that had just landed in its web. It was a predator, announcing its presence, savoring the fear of its trapped and helpless prey. Or perhaps, worst of all, it was an invitation, a welcome to the club, a greeting from an established resident to a new arrival. Welcome, the knocking might be saying. Welcome to the long, dark night. Your life above is over, but your existence is just beginning. Soon you will be like me, aware, awake, and very, very patient. We have an eternity to get to know one another. This was the most chilling possibility of all. It suggested that death was not an end, but a transformation into the state of aware, conscious, and eternal imprisonment. It suggested that the graveyard was not a place of rest, but a subterranean city populated by silent, sentient horrors. And he was its newest citizen. The air in the coffin was becoming toxic. His lungs burned with every shallow breath. Black spots began to dance in his vision, sparkling against the absolute darkness like a constellation of dying stars. He knew he had only moments left. His body was shutting down, and in these final, precious moments of life, he was faced with a single, terrible, and all-consuming choice: to knock back, or not to knock, to die in the silence of his own terror, leaving the question unanswered, the communication one-sided, or to engage, to lift his raw and bleeding knuckles, to press them against the rough wood of his coffin wall, and to answer the call from the abyss, to reply to the neighbor in the dark. What would happen if he did? Would the knocking from the other side stop, its purpose fulfilled? Or would it change, becoming more frantic, more excited, a predator roused by the response of its prey? Would it try to answer him, to spell out words, to tell him the secrets of the grave? Or would his own knocking simply be the final act of his life, a last, futile gesture of defiance before the darkness claimed him completely? He was a member of the Wonder Club, a man who had built his identity on a foundation of foolish curiosity and bravado. It was that very curiosity that had led him into this tomb. And now, at the very end, he was faced with the ultimate wonder, the ultimate mystery. What was on the other side of the wall? His arm felt impossibly heavy. The simple act of raising his hand required a Herculean effort. He could feel the last of his strength, the last of his consciousness, beginning to ebb away. The roaring in his ears was growing louder, drowning out the frantic beating of his heart. But through it all, he could still hear the knocking. It was fainter now, as if heard from a great distance. But it was still there, patient, rhythmic, insistent. Tap, tap,
Top.
it was the last sound he would ever hear, the last question he would ever face. To die alone, or to die in conversation with a nightmare. He lifted his hand an inch from his chest. His knuckles brushed against the splintered wood. The choice was his. The eternal night awaited his answer. Trapped 6 feet under the earth, Jack has discovered the ultimate horror. The grave is not the end. For him it is a crowded, noisy place. The knocking continues, a patient, eternal rhythm in the dark. Who is knocking from the other side? And will Jack ever escape the graveyard's living coffin? Let us know what you think below. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth.